All right, today is June 14th, 2017. I'm here with Father Gary Wright. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So my first question for you is, what led you to the religious life?
Well, there's only one good answer to that question, which is God. Of course, there's human factors that are involved. I think for me, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and that was a time of a lot of social change and big social movements. It was the civil rights movement was at its peak. The Vietnam War and its protests were going on. There were the liberation movements in the African nations after getting rid of colonialism. And I think I was caught up in all of those and was inspired to want to be part of the change that was going on in the world, and felt very drawn to do something for the human family. I could also mention there were some key teachers I had in high school that I think got me thinking about what I was going to do with my life and asking that sort of question. And then I think a factor too would just be the fact that I grew up in 1950s Catholicism, went to Catholic school my whole life, and at that time, if you wanted to give your life to serving other people, well, it seemed obvious what you would do is become a priest. I think if I grew up today, that might not be so obvious. There are more options, or more ways of people thinking about serving others. And any rate, you can look at all those human factors, but in the end, at this point, I just celebrated my 50th anniversary of entering the Jesuits a couple of weeks ago. So at this point in my life, I look back on it at another level. You just say, yeah, all those reasons are there, but how can you explain this? How was it that when I was 5 or 6, I was thinking about being a priest? How was it that when I was in 8th grade, I thought about going into the seminary and almost did? You look back on it and you say, there's something about that mystery that we call God that was, clearly looking back, was pulling on me from an early point in my life, and that's what led me to. But basically, my impulse was connected with that drive to what we would call social justice today, and to wanting to be a part of contributing to the human family and its development. So
great.
Yeah.
So my next question would then be, why did you choose the Jesuits?
Well, that's a good question, because I didn't know anything about Jesuits before I entered, really. And it was just from a very kind of bookish knowledge of them. I knew that they had something to do with schools and education, and at that point, I was more interested. I didn't want to be a parish priest, because that looked boring to me at that time. And I thought, education, that's where you're really helping to change people and shape their thinking and so forth. Now, the irony is, the first thing I did as a Jesuit after I was ordained was be a parish priest, and the last thing I'm doing in my career is being a parish priest, and I never was a teacher, so. But it was that quality of the Jesuits. But the biggest thing was, it was the time of the Second Vatican Council, a huge period of change in the church, adapting itself to the modern world. And I noticed that many of the articles in the secular press and magazines and newspapers were by Jesuits, and they seemed very forward-looking to me, and I was drawn to them because of what I was seeing in print. And there was one Jesuit in particular, Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French philosopher and scientist, you might say, in the first half of the 20th century, who was really the first person to put together perspective on science and faith, to kind of bring together a modern viewpoint and a religious faith and work out an integration. And one of my high school teachers gave me some of his works when I was 16, and I was already starting to question my faith and thinking, this doesn't fit with the modern understanding at all, And so he was very crucial in kind of opening an intellectually respectable path forward for me. And so he was a Jesuit. I thought, well, I'm going to look into these guys.
Great, thank you. So can you tell us about your formation, your academic background?
Well, compared to a lot of Jesuits, there isn't much academic background in the sense that I have been more of a pastoral person, as I said, than an educator. So my formation began with the novitiate, which is 2 years of spiritual formation at Columbier here in Clarkston, Michigan. And at that time, that was actually, I think, institutionally part of what was then the University of Detroit. What we did as classes there were credited here at the university. And then after that, I went to what we call now our first studies, our college program and philosophy, and that was right here. So I lived in this building where we're doing this interview when I was a college student, and that was back in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think that's worth mentioning and pausing about, because it was right after the Vatican Council, and there's so many big changes happening in the church. Prior to that point, all of our formation had always been located out in the country at remote, isolated locations. When I first entered the novitiate, we weren't even allowed to go off the property. And so this big shift started catching up with religious life. So they moved our college program from Clarkston onto a campus in a city. That was a big deal. And many people were very worried about it. If they took us out of the hothouse out in the countryside, would we all, fall in love with the first co-ed we met and lose our vocations? And in fact, a lot of people did leave. But that was probably good, because it was like putting us into the real world and saying, if your vocation is going to last, it's got to, survive in reality. So that was really exciting to be here at the beginning of a whole new approach to Jesuit formation. Also, what was significant, I just want to mention this about the university, we had just some outstanding professors, Jesuits who were early in their careers, and they went on to become really world-famous scholars in their areas. So I just had outstanding courses and an education here that laid a foundation. Let's see, a little bit more. So this would be one of my longer answers, because I think it's most significant. Then after that, we have a working period where we're not in school. That's part of our formation. Let me come back to that and just finish the academics. So after the working period, I went to graduate school and for our basic theology studies, and that was in Berkeley, California. Again, I arrived there just a few years after the Jesuits had moved their graduate school from a remote location in the California hills to the campus of Cal Berkeley, which was the center of the student movements of the 60s and 70s. So it was very exciting to be plunked down in the middle of that. And also, we were part of a cluster of, I think it was 9 other seminaries that were at Cal Berkeley. So it was we could cross-list classes between the different seminaries, so it was a very exciting and novel approach to theology studies. So let me say a little bit about that work period, because this really, I think, in some ways, if you want to inquire about my life, is a key to the whole story. So Jesuits routinely, after our college studies, would go out to work in a ministry for a few years. And the typical thing was, in that era, we were sent to teach in one of our Jesuit high schools. And so I was sent to St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, and turned out to be an absolute, stunning, resounding failure at being a teacher. And I think under the stress of that position, it always seemed to me, and the fact that I wasn't any good at it, I got really sick, mononucleosis, and although that's typical of people in their early 20s. So you got to picture this. My students, I had seniors, they're 18, I was all of barely 22, I think, and half of my students look older than I was, so it was not a good scene. But at any rate, I'm very sick, and this Jesuit comes and prays for me while I was sick, and I experienced a dramatic and instant healing. And it was just blew me away, because at that point I had no reference to anything like that, and was stuck sitting there saying, this can't have happened. What just happened to me is not possible. And so that set me off on a period of having to investigate, what was this? What happened to me? And, it started altering my picture of God, my understanding of Jesus, and I realized I had, even though I was in the Jesuits for 5 years at that point, that Jesus for me was somebody who lived 2,000 years ago in history, was a great teacher. I admired his teachings and what he said, but this healing experience made me say, ooh, he's not just back there in history someplace. There's some presence and power that's active right now in our world that has a personal interest in me and a personal care for me. This was like unheard of in my way of thinking. And it set me off on a kind of a journey to understand this, to read about it, and then I was sent to work at our retreat after my failure in teaching. I was sent to work at our retreat center and high school retreats in Cincinnati, Ohio. And while I was there, I heard about a community of young adults that was involved in a renewal movement where there were healings and prophecies and people speaking in tongues, and out of desperation I checked that out because I thought maybe these people can help me understand what I experienced. And it was so repulsive to me, people speaking in tongues and the style of prayer that they were into, but I kind of forced myself into it out of this desperation, to understand what was unfolding in my life. And it turned out I ended up not only getting involved, but they asked me to come and work with them for a couple of years. And so I was able to work with Richard Rohr, who later went on to be a big famous world speaker and author in Catholic renewal. And that really was a very key point in my life. Most Jesuits would spend maybe 2 years teaching in a high school. I ended up being 5 years between undergraduate and graduate school. But I look back on that the kind of spiritual evolution and revolution that took place in me in that time, in really experiencing the power and presence of this mystery that we so glibly call God in my life and in our world and in other people. That was transformative. I think really laid the foundation for the rest of my Jesuit life. And also being with Richard Rohr, who was a great theological teacher, really laid the foundation for my theological education that came next. So you ask about my formation, it's a big question because in a lot of ways my formation took place in those 5 years. I have to be honest, I look back at my novitiate, which was sort of in the old mold before. It was partly reformed by the Vatican Council, but it was really the old style. I say, would I be the person I am today if I hadn't gone through the novitiate? And I would say yes. I'd be pretty much the same. But if you ask, would I be the same person without that period in Cincinnati, those 5 years? No. That was key in developing my sense of mission and ministry and who I am today.
Great. So I know you already kind of answered this question, but if you want to add anything else, what led you to your role at the University of Detroit Mercy?
Oh, well, no, that is a good question because I was here for my college years, but then was off 25 years of my Jesuit life after that, the rest of my schooling and my first ministry assignments. First 2, actually. So 25 years, let's roll the clock forward. I had worked at the parish across the street, Jesuit parish, right after I was ordained. And then I was asked to go into Jesuit formation work. So I was training Jesuit novices at the first stage of our seminary training right here in Berkeley, Michigan. And I did that for about a decade. And after that, I had a sabbatical and was asking, well, what do I do next? And I was talking with our religious superior, and I said, well, I saw an ad in the paper that the campus ministry position at Detroit Mercy is open. I'm not sure I'm interested in that, but maybe I'd like to look into it. And he says, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to assign you to that. I'm like, wait a minute, I don't even know if I'm interested in it yet. But it was sort of a done deal that I said, you got to interview and get hired for this. Don't you think I should go through that first? And he goes, oh, you'll get it. Just go. So the rest is history. I came here, and it did carry on my work with young people. I've been working with young adults in the seminary, so I came here as director of campus ministry in, that would have been 1997. And then was in that position until 2010. In the course of those years, I also was asked to be the rector of the Jesuit community, so I was the religious superior of this building and of all the Jesuits that lived here. That got me involved in the board of trustees of the university, and I stayed on the board for a couple years after I finished my term as campus ministry director. And in that position, I got involved in revising and updating the bylaws and the governance of the university. So I ended up getting pretty involved in a lot of things. And another thing that was unique, I realized a lot of the Jesuits here are professors, and they get to know their department and their college and the university. But because of my position as director of ministry, it was very privileged. I got to know people all over the whole university. I pretty much knew, I think, the vast majority of people in the Fisher Building, all the administration, all the deans, a lot of the faculty. It was really a very interesting way to be in a university.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
My next question, again, you already kind of touched on, but how has your ministry changed over the years?
Well, let me think about that a minute.
Okay.
Well, it's a big change, I would say, and I'm just now appreciating that more and more. So my first two assignments after being ordained, as I mentioned, were at the parish and then working in our novitiate. And so in both of those places, I had a sort of a ready-made audience. It's an institution where people come that are interested in growing in their faith. So I kind of, without thinking about it, understood ministry to be, well, I've got all my training and preparation, I've got all my own spiritual development, and I'm ready to share that with people and to help them in their spiritual development. And pretty much you just show up and people are there and they're interested and they come seeking that. So then when I left the novitiate and came here to the university, it was almost the opposite. You come to the university campus, it's largely secularized. God is not first on the agenda of most college students. So I went from a place where people were eager and wanted to learn about spirituality to coming into a situation where probably most people couldn't care less. And so it really made a shift of saying ministry has to be a kind of going out and inviting people into their spiritual journey, getting them interested maybe in something they aren't interested in. And now, after my years here at the university, another sabbatical period, I'm now the pastor of our parish, our oldest Jesuit ministry in the city, St. Peter and Paul's, our old church downtown, where the university first started, and now is our law school campus. And once again, I'm there at the heart of the downtown. There's a big change in the city, kind of a rebirth going on, and a very tiny parish. The congregation dwindled over many years down to a very small group. So now I'm again in a position of having to be inviting people, and especially the young adults that are moving back into the city, kind of reaching out more. So I would say my ministry changed from, kind of, what was that old movie, Field of Dreams, build it and they will come. It's sort of sit there and people will come to you interested in faith. And the second half of my life in the Jesuits has been much more, you can't just sit there. You've got to think about, how do you reach out to people? How do you, in our secular time, get people to ask themselves questions of faith. So a lot of my time here at the university, I think, was invested in not just talking with people about their own spiritual life and their faith life, but thinking about the whole university as an institution. How do you introduce structures and practices that raise questions of faith and spirituality for everybody that's here? So kind of my ideal would be, if you're a student at UDM, at Detroit Mercy, or you're a faculty member here, if you're involved in any way, you can't be here without the very fabric or structure of the place, at least at some point, making you stop and think, well, what about my own spiritual life? What is it? What is my faith? Is that important to me? How do I grow in that? So, and in a similar way, in my role now at a downtown church, how can that church not just be a parish where people come to learn about their own faith, but how do we reach out and be a presence in the downtown, a part of the civic life, be known in the city as and among young people? Well, that's a place you can go if you're interested in spirituality, and they're interested in me, they're reaching out to me. So it's a big shift, I would say, and it fits in with how the church is developing now, which I think is asking itself, how do we not just be kind of a club for our own members to live in their faith world, but the church really needs, Pope Francis is bringing this up so much, how do we be a church that is turned outward toward the world, towards engaging with culture, engaging with people where they're at, and hopefully sharing what we have that has meant something to us in our lives with other people.
Great.
Okay.
So my next question is, how has your relationship with God evolved throughout your life as a Jesuit?
Oh, a lot. But it's hard to put into words. And the older I get, that would be one of the changes. The more clear it is that the spiritual realities that are most important are really beyond words. And that's probably a shift, because in my earliest years, it's all about words. You know, you're learning to talk about your faith, about your spirituality, about God. You go to graduate school, you take all these courses, you read the whole Bible and study everything. It's all about words, words, words. How can I learn more about? But as I've grown and matured in my faith life, I guess I feel I've been drawn more and more out of all of those words and conceptualizations to dealing with people and the realities of their lives, dealing with the human realities of my own life, and in that experiencing God more and more deeply in the realities of human life and of our world. And that moves you beyond words to the kind of unspoken level of the things that matter most to people. The questions of love and purpose and meaning in life, which I think people ultimately arrive at not by getting some verbal formulation of it, but by arriving at some intuitive grasp of their meaning and why they're here and what they're living for. And I mean, I've been 50 years working with people about their spiritual development, and I think it's true for everyone that we only dimly grasp this mystery we call God when we're younger, and really our whole lifetime is an unfolding of that mystery and a journey in which our image of God and our relationship with God is constantly evolving and changing, if we attend to it at all, if we pay attention at all. And I think that the changes in life stage and periods of life that we pass through if we're alive and attending to our inner life, each change in our life makes us kind of reassess, rethink our image of God. Especially what I see in people is their tragedies and losses are the things that, so to speak, bring us to our knees and make us ponder what's really happening. I just spent time yesterday with a young man, one of the young adults that's involved with us. Newly married, his wife is pregnant, and the pregnancy has gone into a crisis at 5 months, and they might lose the baby. Well, that's the kind of thing that really shatters your easy thinking about God and faith. And people face these things all the time, and it's through those crises that we really are pushed to our deepest levels, I think. So I can't, I don't know. In an interview like this, it's hard to think how to articulate that. I could just say it has changed a lot over the years. It's deepened. The things that matter stand out more. Let me just see, what would I say? I guess an important thing to say would be, the whole journey focuses more and more on love and compassion, and I'm lousy at both of those, but it's clear that's what the journey's about. I want to become a person of love and compassion and convey a radical acceptance to other people of where they're at, what they're struggling with in their lives. I want to become love, to put it that way. I'm nowhere near it, but I know that's what. So the kind of the goal or the target gets clearer over the years. And the other thing is, while in some ways God becomes more and more mysterious, less and less about God the older you get. At the same time, in a mysterious way, a sense of security and familiarity and confidence in the relationship with one's own Creator grows. My familiarity with the person of Christ, not that guy in history that's in the Bible that I knew when I was 17 or 18 coming into the Jesuits, but the mystery of Christ living in us, alive in us today, it's more familiar. There's a kind of a confidence and security and familiarity and strength in that relationship that I hope supports everything I'm doing and my ministry now and what I can share with others.
Wow, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So my next question is, again, you already kind of touched on this one, but is there anything else you would like to add about your experience that informed your ideas about social justice?
So as I think I said, that was really the foundation of my vocation. I think for guys in the Jesuits who are a generation older than me, that wasn't part of the church culture when they started out. So maybe that's something they learned or got interested in later in their Jesuit life, whereas for me, it was foundational. The Jesuits had a big international gathering following up on the Second Vatican Council. I think it was in the early to mid-70s, where we really defined for ourselves that our mission wasn't just about faith, but that faith and social justice were intertwined. Well, that's kind of how I came in the front door already with that perspective. It just seemed natural to my generation. I think how it's changed over the years is, I think in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a tremendous optimism in the culture, especially among my generation, about social change and about achieving social justice. And the change for me was our whole generation realized it ain't easy and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think the optimism and enthusiasm that I had in my early years was very naive, And so in the course of a life, you learn social change comes very slowly at a high cost. We were, I think back, I don't know how much you know about the late 60s and 70s. You've probably seen it in movies, but we were all about protests and marching in the street and picket signs, and that did change some things. It woke cultural institutions up to change. I hate to say it, but I was involved when I was, I never thought of this for years. When I was here, it was right as a college student in my young Jesuit years, it was right at the heart of the anti-war movement. And I was very involved in that. As a college student, I remember we were in a sit-in the president's office in the 5th floor of the administration building. And when I came back there, the next time I was back there was as a trustee of the university. And I'm sitting in the boardroom like, oh yeah, I remember being in here, sitting on the floor, with our hair as long as yours, singing our protest song. So it was a very heady period. It was exciting, and it did wake up institutions like universities and churches and governments to a need to change and to be transformed and to deal with racial disparities and economic inequalities and so forth. But then as the years passed, you realize protests and picket signs don't do the job. They maybe get things started, they wake people up, but it's the long process of institutional change and how do you do that? And now I think even more we're seeing you can't just work on institutional change. People really have to be transformed from within in their perspectives and on their values. And we're seeing the role of experience, I think, much more for instance, in our universities, through things like spring break trips and even immersion trips for faculty, that people are changed by actually having experiences that pull them outside of their familiar zones in life, across borders, both physical, geographical borders, across social borders and boundaries in our society and culture. So I've had to have a lot of those experiences myself. So I guess that it's a whole journey, I think, from an enthusiasm for social justice that was very naive in the beginning to now a more sitting back and constantly scratching my head and saying, how do we actually help lead institutions and culture to systemic changes that really make the world more just and more equitable for people. And I'm right in the middle of that, being in downtown Detroit right now. It's exciting to be part of the renaissance of the city and the rebirth and young people moving into downtown, but we all know that is it just going to be a kind of a recolonization of the downtown by the wealthy and by upwardly mobile young professionals, or is it going to be a transformation that really affects the neighborhoods, that really changes the city, that lifts everybody up, and changes the education scene, changes the employment scene in the city? Everybody knows those are not easy projects. They're long haul works. We need faith. It brings me back to all that spirituality stuff I talked about. I think we need that kind of spiritual life, and that's what I'm working with in the parish, to sustain people and to guide people and to move people into social justice.
Great. So coming off of that question,
okay.
How does the Jesuit charism influence your work?
Well, that seems pretty easy to answer. I think key to our Jesuit way of life, going back to its beginnings in the 16th century with St. Ignatius of Loyola, is that it is a spirituality of service and engagement with the world. It's an activist spirituality. And so I think my life has been oriented from the beginning to service and to engagement. And that's what moves me now when I finished my term here at Detroit Mercy in campus ministry, and I was thinking about what do I do next. That's just when young people were starting to move back into the downtown. The city was starting to come back, and it was that sense of engagement with what's happening in the culture and our context that moved me to say to my superior, hey, could I go work downtown? I think after years as a campus minister, I might be able to do something with young adults. So I think that it's a spirituality of engagement and service. That's the foundation. In particular, I think the gifts that Jesuits bring out of our spiritual tradition are those of Ignatian spirituality, and primarily I see that a gift of paying attention to one's inner life and then growing in what we call, our big buzzword is discernment, being able to sort out what's happening in my inner life, how I'm being affected by the people around me. And through that discernment of how God and the Spirit, how good and evil are at work inside of me, I find my way forward a step at a time. And I think that's what I bring to my ministry in the parish, introducing Ignatian discernment and the spirituality of service and engagement to the parish. Of course, Jesuits have been there since, 1877, so a lot of the people that have been there a long time are well steeped in that, but the younger people, it's a new thing to introduce them to it. And it was certainly foundational in my previous assignments. Working in the Jesuit novitiate, the formation of Jesuits really immersed me in our particular Jesuit spirituality to help young men grow into that, to be able to share it with others in their life. One of the things I'm doing now, this kind of relates to the university too. We just started this last year, a leadership development program for young adult professionals. And this is all about bringing my whole lifetime of Jesuit spirituality to young professionals and helping them find a way of integrating faith and spirituality with their work life, with their contributions to the civic community in Detroit, to their family life. And I'm finding young adults, millennials, are really excited about this. They're rising to it. They say, that's what I want in my life. And I think that's what Jesuits do best, is help people integrate spirituality and faith with the secular world, with their work lives, with their professions. And so we're trying to do that for millennials right now. I got 17 young adults, ages 24 to 34. We just last Sunday finished our first year of the program. It's a 2-year program. They're excited, they're engaged, and at our session, we were right in this room last Sunday, and they were saying how it's affected them, and several of them shared stories about how already they're thinking about things or making decisions differently in their workplace. So I think those give you some of my key features of Jesuit spirituality and approach that are very much a part of what I'm doing now.
Yeah, great. So my last question for you is, how do you see the Society of Jesus and the Church changing in the future?
I will tell you, disclaimer first of all, every prediction I've ever made in my life about the future has turned out to be wrong. So I don't think I want to say too much about that. And that's wonderful. I mean, life, we make our human assessments and our human judgments about where things are go, but it's the nature of life to be full of surprises and the unknowns. And so I think that's a very hard question for me to answer. I think I just pull out a couple things, maybe convictions I have from my years of ministry. Karl Rahner, great Jesuit theologian of the 20th century, I won't have this quote exactly, but he said something like, if there are going to be any Christians in the future at all, they're going to be mystics. And what he meant by that is institutional religion is not going to survive just on its institutional merits. People have their membership card, they belong. When he said people have to be mystics, he meant they have to have a deep personal engagement with faith with God, with this mystery we call God, with the transcendent. So I think that's how things are changing, that I see everywhere people are longing for something that is authentically their own, that deeply engages them personally. So I think the church, Jesuits, our mission are going to keep moving in that direction of facilitating personal encounter, personal change for people as the basis for our work in institutional change or social change, societal change. That's not really a change, it's just, I think, a progression of where we are now and where we're headed. I think another big note that is kind of new in our times, it began for me back in the 60s, but I do think we're getting much more aware that the social justice issues that we have been engaged with for many years are very tied now to issues of the environment and ecology, and realizing that the issues of environmental justice are the issues of the poor often. So I also think that's a change that's going to come to the fore more and more strongly in the coming years. I think that globalization is impacting us, impacting ministry, impacting the church, impacting universities and other cultural institutions, that as people move around more and more on the planet, we're all going to have to learn to deal much more with diversity. And in my particular field, it's helping people navigate religious diversity. That's one of the things I see in millennial young adults. They're saying, well, I took a course on Buddhism, or the guy that works in the carrel next to me is a Muslim, and aren't all paths equally the same? They're all paths to God. So we're all navigating a world of diversity and pluralism, and I think that's going to be an inescapable note of our future.
Great. So that was my last question, but is there anything else you'd like to add that maybe I didn't touch on in the questions for the History Project? Well,
Since you're interviewing people that are here at the University of Detroit Mercy, I would just say, my years here, let's start as a student, when I was a young Jesuit, never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be back working here, because as my life unfolded, it was pastoral. I didn't get a doctorate. I didn't go into education. Well, I ended up back here 25 years later, and was here. This has been the longest working period of my life, was my years at the university. And now it's very interesting to see 5, 6 years later how my immersion in the university carries on in my life now. I really see what I'm doing at the parish in the downtown is building on this. All the people I met, all the alumni that I know, not just alums from my era when I worked here, but older alumni that I met through university events. It's coming together. I'm involved in starting this an organization for any alumni of any Jesuit school anywhere who live in Detroit today, and that's so drawing on my career here at the university and my time here. My work with young people, I'm dealing, not all of those 17 young professionals are alums of Detroit Mercy, but some of them are. I'm building on that. So it feels like what I'm doing now is just an extension on a foundation that was laid here of countless relationships with university people, collaborations I can draw on now, and with people who have been touched by the university in their lives, who now live or work in the downtown. So I think that's something, maybe just with my 50th anniversary, I'm reflecting more and more on how all the pieces of one's life build together and help contribute to the pieces of the puzzle, the pieces of who you are and what you're doing, even when you're an old man like I am now. So.
Great. Well, thank you.
All right.